Reid's hands were his livelihood, and he treated them with the reverence most reserved for sacred relics. Each digit was long, calloused in the right places, and utterly steady. Today, they moved with a surgeon's precision over the flaking gesso of an 18th-century portrait frame. The whisper of the fine-grit sandpaper against the ancient wood was the only sound in his workshop, a comforting rhythm that had defined his existence for decades. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of late-afternoon sun piercing the high window, illuminating the controlled chaos of his space, jars of pigments, solvents. Glues lined shelves, alongside an array of chisels, brushes. Custom-made spatulas, each tool meticulously cleaned and returned to its designated slot after use. He valued order, structure, and the quiet dignity of history preserved. Objects, unlike people, held their secrets in plain sight, waiting for the patient hand to reveal them. They didn't complicate things with shifting moods or unspoken expectations. This preference for the inanimate had, admittedly, made his life a rather solitary affair, but it was a solitude he found deeply satisfying. The news of the inheritance had arrived like a misplaced piece of mail, an anomaly in his otherwise predictable routine. A distant, forgotten relative, a great-aunt he'd never met, had bequeathed him a manor house. Not just any house, the solicitor had explained with a dry cough, but Blackwood Manor, a property of considerable age and, apparently, equal neglect, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the county. Reid had accepted the keys with a polite nod, his mind already calculating the structural integrity of a building he hadn't yet seen. It was a project, a colossal one, but a project nonetheless. The drive itself was a descent into a different kind of quiet. The asphalt roads gave way to crumbling tarmac, then eventually to a narrow, overgrown track that wound through skeletal trees. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight, which had been a cheerful presence in his workshop, seemed to struggle here, filtering through a perpetual gray haze. My sedan, usually a reliable extension of my ordered life, felt small and vulnerable as the trees closed in, their branches clawing at the sky like arthritic fingers. The silence outside the car was profound, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my tires and the distant, mournful sigh of the wind. And then, it appeared. Not abruptly, but gradually, asserting its presence through the thinning veil of trees. Blackwood Manor. It wasn't just a house, it was a hulking, brooding silhouette against the bruised sky. A monument to neglect. Gables sagged, chimneys leaned precariously, and countless windows stared out like vacant eyes, many of them shattered or boarded over. A sense of immense weight pressed down on the landscape, emanating from the very stones of the house. It wasn't merely old, it felt ancient, heavy with uncounted years and untold stories. I cut the engine, and the sudden silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I sat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, my initial professional assessment giving way to a prickle of something less tangible. This wasn't just a restoration job, it was an undertaking that felt sentient. The manor seemed to watch me, its broken eyes observing my arrival. The air, even through the closed windows of my car, carried a distinct odor, a sharp, metallic tang overlaid with the cloying sweetness of rot and mildew. It was the smell of something long undisturbed, slowly decomposing. Stepping out, the gravel crunched loudly under my boots, a jarring intrusion into the hushed landscape. I walked towards the massive oak front door, which was warped and weathered, its iron fittings pitted with rust. A heavy iron knocker, shaped like a grimacing gargoyle, seemed to mock my presence. With a final, protesting shudder, the door swung inward. A blast of frigid, stagnant air rushed out to greet me, carrying with it a concentrated essence of the manor's decay. Dust motes, thick as fog, danced in the anemic shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. The ceiling soared far above, lost in gloom. Cobwebs, thick and gray, draped like funereal banners from every chandelier and cornice. The air was so heavy with the scent of mold, damp plaster, and something else, something vaguely metallic and unsettling, that it felt like breathing liquid. I took a deep, steadying breath, trying to push past the immediate, overwhelming sense of abandonment. This was a project, I reminded myself, a challenge. I would approach it systematically, as I always did. I began my initial survey, moving slowly, methodically, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Grand reception rooms with peeling wallpaper, libraries where books had collapsed into dusty piles, dining halls with tables still set for ghostly feasts. Each room was a tableau of neglect, a testament to a sudden, unexplained departure. Then, I found it. Tucked away in what appeared to be a forgotten wing, accessible only through a narrow, unmarked door disguised within a paneled wall, was a passage unlike any other in the house. The passage itself was unadorned, devoid of the manor's usual Baroque flourishes. It led down a short, steep flight of bare stone steps, opening into a subterranean space. My flashlight beam cut through the absolute blackness, revealing a series of heavy, iron-barred doors set into thick concrete walls. Each door was equipped with a small, sliding hatch and a formidable lock. The space was utterly stark, brutalist in its simplicity, utterly at odds with the decaying grandeur above. I moved closer, my boots echoing unnaturally on the stone floor. Behind each barred door lay a small, windowless chamber, barely large enough for a cot. The walls were scarred with what looked like old scratch marks, faint yet deeply unsettling. My meticulous mind, accustomed to cataloging and identifying, struggled to reconcile this discovery. This wasn't a wine cellar. This wasn't a storage room. This was a sequence of small, individual chambers, each designed for solitary confinement. The architectural language was unmistakable. I stood in what could only be described as a set of segregation unit isolation cells, buried deep beneath Blackwood Manor. The metallic tang in the air here was strongest, almost tasting of old fear. This manor held more than just forgotten treasures, it held forgotten horrors. And I, Reid, had just opened the door to them. The drawing room, or what was left of its former glory, became my temporary sanctum. Sunlight, filtered through grime-caked panes and the skeletal branches of an ancient oak, painted weak patterns on the dust motes dancing in the air. I'd spent the better part of a day just clearing a space, draping protective sheets over what furniture remained, hulking, shrouded forms like forgotten gods, and setting up my work table. My tools, meticulously arranged in their leather rolls and wooden trays, were a small island of order in a sea of decay. I resumed work on the portrait frame, the delicate gesso a familiar challenge. My hands, accustomed to such exacting tasks, moved with an almost subconscious grace, applying minuscule drops of adhesive, nudging flakes back into place with a fine-tipped spatula. The silence of the manor was absolute, save for the occasional groan of ancient timbers or the whisper of the wind through broken eaves. It was the kind of silence that pressed in, not comforting, but expectant. I reached for my smallest microbrush, the one with sable hairs no thicker than a human eyelash. My fingers grazed the velvet lining of its slot in the wooden tray. Empty. I frowned. I always put it back immediately after use. Always. I just used it to apply a thin wash to a particularly stubborn chip on the frame's acanthus leaf. It couldn't have rolled away, the tray was perfectly level. A minor irritation. I scanned the tabletop, then the floor around my feet. Nothing. Perhaps I'd put it in the wrong slot? No, that was illogical. My system was foolproof. I sighed, rummaging through a larger, less specialized brush roll, pulling out a substitute. It was a minor thing, easily dismissed as a lapse in my own meticulousness, but a faint, unfamiliar prickle began at the base of my neck. An hour later, I found the microbrush. It wasn't in any of my rolls. It wasn't on the floor. It was wedged between two heavy art history tomes on a sagging bookshelf across the room, a good 20 feet from my table. And it was clean, not a speck of gesso or adhesive on its delicate hairs. My breath caught a small, involuntary hitch. I distinctly remembered cleaning it before placing it back. But I hadn't placed it there. That was impossible. My internal monologue, usually a calm, analytical stream, stuttered. I picked up the brush, turning it over in my fingers. Had I, in some profound moment of absent-mindedness, walked across the room, placed it there, and forgotten? The idea felt alien. My memory was sharp, precise, a necessary tool for my profession. This felt off. I told myself it was the isolation, the sheer quiet, playing tricks. The manor was vast, and I was the only living soul within its walls. The next afternoon, the creaking started. It wasn't the settling of wood, the deep, resonant groans I'd come to expect from the old house. This was a lighter, more rhythmic sound, like footsteps on a distant floorboard, slow and deliberate. It seemed to emanate from the upper floors, directly above where I worked. I paused, my hand hovering over the delicate work, listening. 1, 2. A pause. 3. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sound stopped. I tried to rationalize it, a branch scraping the roof, perhaps a loose shutter. But the rhythm had been too distinct, too purposeful. I found myself glancing at the doorway, then the windows, an inexplicable tremor starting in my spine. I was alone. I had to be alone. A few days later, the sensation of being watched became almost palpable. It was a pressure on my back, a prickling on my scalp, even when I was facing away from any windows or doorways. I'd spin around, spatula still in hand, to find nothing but empty air, the shifting dust, the silent, judging presence of the shrouded furniture. My eyes began to dart, constantly scanning the periphery of my vision. When I looked directly, there was never anything there. Just the ancient, peeling wallpaper and the encroaching gloom. The determined focus I usually brought to my work began to fray. My hands, usually so steady, sometimes developed a tremor, not from fatigue, but from an underlying agitation. I was growing restless, unable to shake the feeling that the house held more than just dust and forgotten memories. It felt like it held secrets, and it was slowly, deliberately, revealing them. Or perhaps, it was simply watching me discover them. One evening, unable to concentrate on the frame any longer, a strange compulsion took hold. I needed to understand the house better, to catalog its strangeness, to find the source of these unsettling disturbances. I grabbed a powerful LED lantern and decided to explore the servants' wing, an area I'd largely avoided due to its advanced state of disrepair. The floorboards groaned under my weight with a less forgiving protest. Then, at the very end of a narrow, lightless corridor, I found it. A heavy, unvarnished wooden door, unlike any other in the manor. It was reinforced with thick iron bands and secured by an enormous, rusted bolt. There was no handle, just a small, sliding hatch at eye level. This wasn't a pantry. This wasn't a storeroom. This was something else entirely. With a grunt, I forced the heavy bolt back. It shrieked in protest, the sound echoing down the corridor. The room beyond was small, windowless, and utterly barren. The walls were rough-hewn stone, scarred with countless scratches and gouges. There was a single, narrow slab of stone that served as a bench, permanently affixed to the wall. The air in here was stagnant, thick with a scent I could only describe as ancient despair. I moved the beam of my lantern across the walls, then to the heavy door. There were more of them. Another 3, exactly identical, lined the opposite wall. Each with the same reinforced door, the same hatch. Not in the clinical sense I associated with modern institutions, but a crude, brutal approximation. Someone had built these into the heart of this decaying manor. Why? What purpose had they served? Who had been kept here? The implications were a physical blow. This wasn't just a house of forgotten history, it was a house of deliberate, cruel confinement. My boot scuffed against something on the floor. I lowered the lantern. A small, tarnished silver locket, no bigger than my thumbnail, lay half buried in the grit. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the fine, almost invisible engraving on its surface. A single, delicate initial, N. It was filled with echoes I couldn't hear, with memories that weren't mine, pressing in. The subtle disturbances, the misplaced tools, the phantom footsteps, the watchful feeling, they weren't just tricks of my mind. The manor wasn't just old, it was actively, subtly, trying to communicate. And what it was showing me, what it was revealing, was far more sinister than I could have imagined. And I felt impossibly exposed. The memory of that distinct, rhythmic sound still clung to me like a chill, despite the morning sun attempting to pierce the heavy clouds. I'd told myself it was the wind, a loose pane, anything but what my gut insisted it was. A deliberate, measured cadence, almost like a slow, heavy knock from somewhere deep within the house. This section felt off. Not structurally unsound, but somehow wrong, a subtle falseness to its plasterwork that my experienced I couldn't ignore. I spent the better part of the morning tapping, listening, running my hands over the cold surface. The manor groaned around me, a symphony of settling timbers and shifting dust, but I learned to distinguish its natural complaints from anything more intrusive. There was a faint, almost imperceptible seam running vertically, hidden beneath layers of aged paint and repairs. Most people would miss it. Most people weren't me. My tools, an array of delicate chisels and a small, sturdy mallet, lay ready on a drop cloth. As I carefully began to pick away at the plaster, a fine white dust plumed, catching in the weak light. The air, already thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, now took on a sharper, mineral tang. Behind the plaster, I expected brick or perhaps an older wooden panel. What I found was neither. A hidden door, then. My heart gave a tight, unwelcome squeeze against my ribs. It took another hour of careful work, my shoulders aching, before I managed to expose the outline of the door. There was no handle, no visible latch. It was sealed, almost hermetically. I ran my fingers along its edge, feeling the subtle give of aged sealant. It wasn't a door meant to be opened casually. It was a door meant to stay closed. Forever. The determination that fueled my restoration work now morphed into something more primal, an insistent need to uncover. It didn't swing open. It slid, grinding against ancient runners, revealing not another room, but a narrow, unlit corridor. The corridor was short, leading to another heavy, ironclad door. This one had a crude, rusted bolt. I slid it back with a shriek of metal, pushing the door open to reveal a space that defied its stately surroundings. This wasn't a forgotten pantry or a hidden study. This was a series of small, windowless enclosures, their walls scarred with deep gouges, the floor a rough, uneven concrete. Each cell-like space was barely large enough for a cot, if one had ever existed. The air here was thick, heavy, tasting of dust and despair. I walked further in, the beam of my lantern dancing over the stark, brutalist architecture. This was a place of containment, of isolation. This was, unmistakably, a forgotten wing that had been carefully sealed off. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Why would a manor house, however old or eccentric, contain such a place? My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the elegant facade with this grim reality. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of disorientation, a momentary blankness. What was I doing here again? My hands were still gripping the lantern, my eyes fixed on the desolate cells, but for a fraction of a second, the purpose, the reason for my presence, had flickered. I shook my head, blaming the shock, the stale air. One of the cells, unlike the others, had a small, rusted metal box bolted to the wall. It was barely visible in the gloom. I approached it cautiously, the hairs on my arms prickling. The box was sealed, but a loose clasp allowed me to pry it open. Inside, nestled amongst crumbling, moth-eaten cloth, was a single, leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, yellowed, filled with a spidery, faded script. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling slightly. As I flipped open the cover, my eyes scanned the first few lines, then the next. It replaces. And when the vessel is empty, it moves on. I read on, my breath catching in my throat. It spoke of attempts to contain the entity, to starve it, to offer it tributes, not of blood, but of recollection, of consciousness. The segregation unit isolation cells, it implied, were built by a desperate ancestor, a former owner who had tried to confine those whose minds had been consumed, perhaps hoping to trap the entity with its victims, or to protect others from their unsettling fate. A wave of nausea washed over me, not from the words themselves, but from a sudden, profound sense of unease within my own head. I tried to recall the name of the previous owner, the one who sold me the manor. It was right there, on the tip of my tongue. A common enough name, I was sure. But it wouldn't come. My mind felt like a sieve, the information slipping away just as I reached for it. It had to be. I was just tired. A misplaced word. A forgotten face. A moment of utter blankness. My grip tightened on the journal, the old leather digging into my palm. I opened my eyes, scanning the eerie cells again, then looked down at the journal. My own name. What was my name again? Reid. Yes, Reid. The answer came, but it felt delayed. Like pulling a forgotten object from a dusty attic. It was there, but it didn't feel as immediate, as mine asterisk, as it should. It was seeping into my core, into the very essence of what I knew myself to be. The entity, the journal declared, was here. And it had found me. And I was already forgetting.